Alan Cunningham, what is your favorite game?
My favorite game is The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. What first got me into games was a combination of my mother and my father, who were both kind of independently into games when I was much younger. My mom, when I was like 5 or 6, my mom got a Nintendo 64, and that was primarily used to play Mario 64, which was her big love. And then she also played Ocarina of Time when I was very, very young, and that has left a deep, seared impression of magic and wonder in my brain, and always will. Um, and then my dad used to like go away a lot for work and travel a lot for work, so he would bring me back these like really old Macintosh edutainment games, essentially, and like kids games,
Hmm.
stuff like Barbie as Rapunzel and like Living Books and Dinosaur Adventure. And I used to play a lot around with kid pics and stuff as well. So
Hmm.
there was like, like that kind of expression and, console gaming, computer gaming kind of combination of things when I was sort of much younger. And a lot of that stuff also kind of, I suppose, was the first step that got me into horror as well, because I'm quite big into horror too.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of things. I mean, you know yourself, there's a lot of stuff in Ocarina of Time that's quite terrifying to young kids to see as well, and but also like exciting. It's like something you can totally see when you're a kid, but it leaves an impression of like fear on you. And then similarly, I used to, when I was very young, played those kind of like haunted house kids games, and that kind of left an impression where I was like clearly made for you, clearly very exciting, but also quite terrifying when you're very, very young.
Hmm.
um and then yeah, we kind of like always been kind of a gaming family. I always have memories of like my mom and dad playing like platformers and Spyro and Crash Bandicoot and Abe's Odyssey. And I used to actually do this funny thing. They said when I was very young, when I was like, again, like when I was 5 or 6, or 7 or 8, I would be like, oh, you just got to go right and up and left and pick up the thing and then go right and down and back. And they go, how the hell do you know this? You're like an infant. Um, I think it might have been a little bit of just kind of reading the intent or something, but it was one of those. They said it was one of the first kind of um, things that left an impression that I was, particularly into games or had a particularly a capacity for them, I suppose, or something when I was younger.
Hmm. I think the through line, we'll get on to Zelda momentarily, but I think the through line sort of starts with your ma basically being in the ocarina. I think that's sort of that through line, that's sort of where everything kicked off.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And then when I was a bit older, I did play it myself, but I definitely remember watching her play it, and the music is like embedded in my, childhood formative core memories. That stuff of like opening a chest and getting an item and traversing, and the beautiful music. I mean, it's amazing. So it'll definitely it's one of my honorable mentions. Bit of a spoiler for later in the episode.
Oh no. Um, so yeah, I find it fascinating as well that you sort of reference Ocarina as a sort of horror game. Again, we'll touch upon Zelda in a minute, but like, um, I find that very fascinating because it's not very a traditionally horror game that you play, especially at a young age, and yet you sort of find that sort of.
Oh,
Oh,
not at all. I mean, it's not at all a horror game. Like no one on earth, I
no,
think,
it's
would
not.
describe Zelda as a horror game. But
No.
as a child, I suppose it was maybe I should describe it as it was my first exposure to like horror-based concepts. Things like
Yes.
spiders
Yes.
dangling above you and like
Yes.
reanimated dead and these kind of like, and then the imminent danger, the constant danger, like game over screens. You see like a lot of people nowadays who are like our age, like some of their first memories of like true horror is like the first time any character dies in any game,
Mm.
including like games made for very small children. It's like there's something really terrifying about that the first time happens when you realize there's consequences for your actions. That's really interesting and
The first
affects you in
thing
your
that
formative
scares
years.
the first thing that scares people is the literal concept of death.
Yeah. That's very on brand for me. Yeah, absolutely.
The reason I say that is because um the first sort of game that I played when I was really young that sort of really scared me was a non-horror game. But it also had horror-ish. No, I wouldn't even say horror-ish elements, but like the way I went about it was really fucking freaky and creepy. And it was Metal Gear Solid 2.
Yeah.
And they ended that game with the Colonel. And I just remember I've said this story before, but I've not said it in quite a while on the show. So I'm just going to reference it for anyone who's sort of sort of tuning in for the first time. So I'm going through Arsenal gear, naked riding, naked as the day was born, and then the Colonel just sort of keeps pestering you in the codec, and he pops up at one point. I think it's after the "I need scissors" 61 call, and he gives a sort of spiel on destroying the final weapon, Metal Gear. And it's not even what he says or how he says it, although that in itself is very creepy, but it's the image that's sort of projected through the codec of this sort of skull faced colonel in
Yeah.
the game. And I see that as an 11-year-old, basically, 11, 12-year-old. I was like, ah! And I just basically run out of my bedroom going, Mommy!
I
Mommy!
definitely absolutely had experiences like that as a kid as well. You're told by your parents, don't watch this movie, don't play this game, or step out for this scene. You won't be able to handle it. And you and your child brain go, of course I can handle it. And then 2 seconds later, Mom, Dad, help.
It's not even that. My parents were sort of very lax in terms of sort of supervision or playing games that probably shouldn't be playing at a certain age, except for Vice City. My mother was, I would say, rather weirdly, but also rather appropriately, very strict against Vice City at least initially. So it sort of tracks for that one. But like
Yeah,
otherwise,
that one, she's vindicated with that one.
yeah, a little bit, a little bit. But I remember just sort of running out of my bed and going, "Oh my, I need help at getting past this creepy colonel person." And she had no clue how to play games at all. So the fact that I was trying to get her to play Metal Gear Solid 2 without a lick of what is going on, and the fact that already, as much as I love Metal Gear Solid 2, as she was trying to sort of get me past what is otherwise a very convoluted aspect of the game at that point in its story. And it's just like 20 years later, I can sort of look back on and be like, dear sweet Jesus, I'm sorry I put you through that now. Then again, she is also dead, so I can't exactly apologize to her now. That's sort of dark humor, and I'm sorry.
No, I'm totally understanding of dark humor. I mean, that's like a lot of like what we were talking about earlier with games as well. A lot of that is like just like sort of methods of sort of dealing with and expressing more difficult kind of themes that
Mm,
like we have to deal with every day in life anyway, like events and aspects of like, I mean, we like Ocarina of Time. No one, it's not a new thing to say that it's sort of a expression of the loss of childhood for a lot of people, and
mm,
that's an incredibly valuable aspect of games, I think.
mm. Um. So moving away, sort of from that aspect, talk about the sort of the platformer sort of aspect of the games you were playing at the time, like Spyro, like Crash, like Oddworld. Like, talk to me a little bit about how you found those sort of games initially.
Well, I was very young. I was just thinking about this when you were talking about. I was very young when I watched my friends play A's Odyssey, and that was like in its own sense, traumatizing to a young child to see as well. But I loved it. I loved the sort of slowly unraveling, this kind of difficult puzzle, but that was intentionally bespoke, made to be satisfying. I mean, that's
Mm.
what a lot of these platforming games are, is this kind of false obstacles, built by humans to make other humans happy, and that's incredibly satisfying. There's nothing quite like figuring out a difficult puzzle designed in a game, if well designed, and I think Abe's Odyssey is an excellent example of that. And like I said, my parents just loved Mario 64, particularly my mom. Said she went into like almost like a low grade state of depression when she'd finished it because she was so into it. And she's actually just recently like replayed like all of the, what was the bundle that released recently with like, it was Mario Galaxy, Mario Sunshine.
Mario All Stars 3D Collection, I think. Yeah.
That's the one, yeah. And she's recently like finished that, and she's like, she loves it so much. So yeah, a big part of that was I was like taking the controller every now and again to play, but I was kind of an anxious kid, so I would hand it back really quickly because I was very young, like 6 or 7. I'd go like, no, I can't do this. It's too scary. But I would the whole time I was a great backseat driver. I was like, no, not like that. This, but faster. It's like, do you want to do it? No.
Oh God, you love to see it. You love to see it.
So basically, my dad is in the film industry. So himself, he's an actor. So I would kind of like, to a small extent, to a healthy extent, like sort of grew up a little bit around film sets and things.
Mm.
And I've loved movies. I've loved films since I was really young. Not surprising. I mean, I think most of us do. And as I was growing older, I knew I always wanted to, make something, express myself in some kind of media platform. And, I'd been around film. I'd done my own like small projects at home, sort of embarrassing kid stuff, but like I loved it. I was so passionate about it. And I went to school to study film. And then while I was in school, I was offered work essentially in VFX, and I left to work there. And I really, really loved the work, and I really, really loved the projects, and I loved what I was doing. But it was so demanding, and in a way, I know this is like a funny thing to say, but in a way it's kind of isolating. You're working like a lot on these like independent, small, tiny chunks of much larger projects entirely on your own a lot of the time. I mean, you have some collaboration, but it's not much of that is there. And it's quite technical, yourself. And so when I was there, I actually left to go back to school because I was lucky enough and privileged enough to be able to go back to school later in life as well. And so I went back to study game design under a collection of absolutely fantastic lecturers, and alongside some wonderful students who I was there with at the time as well, who are very talented people in the industry now. There's so many people in our industry in Ireland who are wonderful, co-students of mine. And when I was there, we did a lot of like, teamwork projects, and but also creating our own individual projects, which you don't get to do very much in film. Even if you're doing something like an editing project, there's a huge demand for like a lot of external help. So there was this kind of great combination of being able to do very, very collaborative stuff with a small team where you're each hearing each other all the time, and to make things entirely on your own that are very expressive. And it's a younger medium. So there's a lot like, the expectations are not as set around what defines the medium. So there's a lot of like really strange and bizarre games. Some of them are big games as well that are really strange and bizarre. And then there's a lot of smaller, like strange projects that are able to be made because they're made by one person or two people. And that's amazing. And I've never been so happy as when I was like studying and creating all of those small projects with people and by myself. And then when I was in school, I was lucky enough again to essentially go in and do some work experience with an indie game development company called Gamberness, based in Dublin, working on their newest project at the time, which was called Cardpocalypse, which is out now on Steam. Wink, wink. But
that comes at the end.
Yeah, that comes. Okay, sorry about that. But it was. But honestly, the experience was amazing. The team were fantastic. I had, a real sense of ownership over what I was doing, but a lot of collaboration. It was very creative, and it was just unbelievable. And actually, still working for them now, and also still making my own projects now as well. So I couldn't be happier with my change. And it's funny because I've always been sort of, I mean, in a small way, in the healthiest way possible, obsessed with games since I was like a very small child. And so it sort of made sense. I told a lot of people, I was like, oh, are you working in film? I was like, oh, actually, I'm actually in games now. They're like, that tracks. That makes sense.
That
I
does
could have
track.
told you that. So
Does make
yeah,
sense.
yeah, I was very lucky. But it's, yeah, that's why I'm now. So I'm a game writer primarily now, but I also do some design and some programming and some art on my own projects as well. Bit of a jack of all trades, really, I suppose.
Mm. I love the fact that you mentioned as well how like from the south perspective how there seems to be so much sort of dev talent sort of grown there as well now. And I just sort of wanted to get your take on, especially considering the female season, considering it's an all Ireland guest lineup, like because I'll happily admit I have a lot of sort of blinkers on when it comes to down south. A lot of the up north, I'm a bit more of a level-headed person now. When it comes to our portion of the island, anyway. Like, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, even now nearly no 2 years ago. 2 years ago, you would if you I wouldn't have been too aware of what was going on here. Besides maybe what was going on here in Derry with Hypixel and Hightail. Now I'm a lot more
Yeah.
aware. Like you got Bellular, previously Coffee Box, now doing the Pale Beyond, Ambertail with Amber Isle, and White Pot doing their own thing with Stargaze and Ho Ho Home Invasion. But like at the same time, a lot. I do have a bit more of a sort of blinkers sort of type deal with the South. Like obviously I know about Romero and sort of the AAA representation in Dublin, like with um Riot and oh god, my mind's going sort of blank now. Who's the ones behind Baldur's Gate? Larian,
Larian, yeah, Larian.
of
Yeah.
course, and then of course Gambrinus as well. Like, it feels like now in
And
terms
Dreamfield, let's not forget Dreamfield
Dreamfield.
with
Oh
their
my god, how could I be so stupid? Ah, I think what I'm trying to get at is Ireland is now finally in a place where it's going to start. It's starting to be taken seriously as its own sort of hotbed within the games industry. Anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and you saw like, this is all stuff that happened with like, you know, little zero to little sort of, support from the state on
Yeah.
like, supporting games. So like I'm on the board of IMERT as well at the moment, so the Irish Game Makers Association. And we recently heard the announcement about the tax credits coming in for companies here as
Yeah.
well. And so it's great. I mean, I think the really important thing about that is that the state itself, and I think, like you said, international, investors and publishers, workers, and company owners are all recognizing Ireland as like, this, like you said, hotbed sort of a base of amazing like cultural talent, creative talent, technical know-how. We're overqualified for kind of how we've been supported up till now. So like imagine in the next few years when things to really start to build in the country, the kind of projects that we're going to be creating, and the kind of wonderful creators that we're going to see thrive here if they're supported well as
Mm.
well. So yeah, it's looking up.
And a lot of publisher interest too, like Riot, not just like centrally with their own offices in Dublin, but obviously with the Hypixel acquisition, but also there's a lot more publisher attention too, like Annapurna and Dreamfield with it Found and um Romero Games and Paradox and etc. Like there is a lot more attention now being paid, even outside just from a publisher perspective, not just necessarily dev perspective as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, it's great to see. I mean, we definitely also do want to for this kind of state recognition and support, which means a lot to people that have been working here as well. We want to make sure that like the indigenous creators here, and maybe the people that haven't had the opportunity to study or to create or have their projects funded here, that those people absolutely are also supported. They're like, they're like the real like cream of what the industry is here, is the kind of creative minds, and then also the technical ability of like students and stuff that are coming out of different courses in the country. So that's like another area that we really, really want to see supported, is kind of indigenous creators also.
Hmm. I guess finally then, in that aspect, before we properly move on to Zelda, like, what would you hope would be the sort of at least in the short term anyway, like within the next say year to 18 months or so, what would you say would be the sort of end game here for the Irish games industry? Not just necessarily the south, but including the north as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see, I would love to see consistently growing high quality employment for people who are currently working in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see more graduates and more graduates of like more varied specialties entering into the industry. I'd like to see some cross skills, like, you know, people who are moving between like the games industry and the film industry and the animation industry here. And I'd also love to see more small projects come out of creators here, to be honest, like some individual projects or some small teams.
Mm.
I'd like to see some more experimental stuff. You know, so these games are not just, you know, like you said, you know, they're not just products, they're cultural products of our country as well. So I'd really like to see some very personal, expressive pieces of art come out of, you know, the creators' minds in the country. So however we can, whatever we can do to support that, as well as bringing, you know, new people here to be supported by us as well. I'd love to see that for
Mm.
sure.
And this is the last question I promise on this before we go to Zelda, because I only just realized this. What about in terms of cross-border collaboration? Because obviously we've got events like Run for the Border and stuff like
Yeah,
that
of
there,
course.
but like, what can we see from that happening? Like in terms of sort of more collaboration between both North and South, in a way.
I mean, I'd love to see, you know, kind of companies maybe have bases in both areas, maybe some more you know, freelance collaboration between different companies. And I'd love to see, yeah, I'd love to see some maybe, you know, along that sort of region, people kind of working together, maybe even tell some stories, you know, and we can do, I mean, that's easy coming from a game writer, but it would be great to see some stories actually, you know, maybe deal with, you know, how people are feeling and what people are thinking and people's experiences, you know, in the games industry, as it's been sort of, I mean, in a way, kind of separated, you know, and thought of very, very, very distinctly from one another. So yeah, I mean, the more we can see, the more we can support collaboration, and the more we can have the support that we need to create stories that express our individual experiences, the more we can use games as a platform to generate empathy with one another and to sort of, you know, break down barriers. Like that's what I think is great about events like Run for the Border. You know, it's like we bring a bunch of people together who might otherwise be separated by even just distance, you know, and really like get to know people with a very possibly very different perspective or different ideas.
Mm,
And that's, you know, always wonderful to see.
absolutely. And here's hoping we can sort of run for the border again at some point soon.
Yeah,
Hopefully, when
yeah,
the pandemic has significantly calmed down and becomes
yeah.
more of an endemic than a pandemic. Because I remember being at that first, not the first, but it was the second one. I remember being at that and just thinking, wow, this is fucking amazing. Seeing all these sort of developers coming together from north and south, just thinking, I would love to have more of this. And then obviously the pandemic kicked off. But I would love to see Run for the Border come back relatively soon, and hopefully we'll
It's
get that.
actually such a wonderful event, and I genuinely hope I get to see it the next one.
Oh, absolutely! Like I like just that one event. Yeah, it's yeah. I hope we get it at some point in 2022. I hope we do. I really really hope we do. Fingers crossed.
Same here.
Let's touch upon your favorite game, The Legend of Zelda, Twilight Princess. The fourth Zelda game we have had on the show. Technically the fifth, because of an unpublished episode that is now basically lost to the winds of time. Um, and Ellen actually basically mentioned what that game was. It was Ocarina. We did have an Ocarina episode at one point, but it is now basically lost to time, basically never to be published.
Very, very thematic.
Very thematic. Very thematic. Um, So you mentioned your past with Ocarina, but before Twilight Princess, anyway, like what was your sort of Zelda history anyway?
Yeah, I mean, like Ocarina of Time is definitely the one that sticks out in my head just because it had such an impression and also was sort of the one that we had in our household. Because obviously it was like a huge release at the time, it was a big deal.
Mm.
And it was kind of, I think it was like released either alongside the Nintendo 64 when it came out or like shortly after, but it was a huge
98,
deal.
about 2 years after
Yeah,
the N64 came out. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So basically, I played Ocarina of Time, and then I can't remember on what platform we had it, but we definitely had the first Zelda and the second Zelda. I played a decent bit of the first Zelda, and I think I thought of it more like a like this was like after Ocarina of Time that I played this, and
Mm.
I think I thought of it more as a toy than as a game that I was trying to complete goals because, and I'll talk about this a bit more later as well. But like, I'm actually quite a big fan of linearity. I'm actually a big fan of like linear experiences and bespoke experiences that are like planned and paced in a particular way. So I wasn't a super huge fan of the first Zelda, and that's also a reason why I'm not a super huge fan of Breath of the Wild. Although I do love Breath of the Wild. I do love Breath of the Wild before everyone attacks me, and I go down in the most infamous of history books. I do. I know I do. I love Breath of the Wild, um, but it is not in my mind what I think of when I think of why I love Zelda games. And this is like obviously, and this is something that's great about games as a medium is it's very subjective. I'm saying this to put up a shield before I keep talking.
Are you
It's
kidding
a
me?
very
Games are
subjective.
objective. You must
It's
like
a
this
very
game. You must.
subjective medium. And I think that's lovely. What a fantastic thing, is that we can each see, different things when we play the same game. We can each have different perspectives and experiences and things that we walk away with. Like me talking about walking away from Ocarina of Time with trauma, plenty of other people, and but also magic, but plenty of other people, walk away from it with, a love of, puzzle solving or a love of nature or, a sad feeling about their childhood. There's like so many different ways to read these kinds of experiences in games because they're so complicated. They're sort of like 4D in a sense in their experience compared to something like books or film or poetry or music. It's such a complex medium, and I do think that that's one of the most beautiful things about it. So I played Zelda 1, and then I played Zelda 2, and I think at the time when I was a kid when I played it, I kind of despised it, which I think is kind of seems to be a consistent sort of feeling. Maybe not despising it, but it not being people's favorites. It seems that a lot of people view it as kind of clunky and kind of sort of complicated, and just essentially, I've very rarely seen it placed in people's like favorite lists. Much later in time, I played Link to the Past, and when it originally came out, and this is like very obviously related to Twilight Princess, I played Wind Waker, but we didn't actually have it in my house when I was a kid. I played it, I think, at my friend's house for a while. And, there was one of two things was going to happen here. Either I was going to, walk away from and go, or I was going to be obsessed with it and like beg my parents to get it for me. And I was just kind of not that into it at the time, which I look back on as unfair because I have played it since then. I played the HD re-release. And before that, even I played more of it as well. And I do love it. I do think it's an excellent game. It's one of the first games that I recommend to people who have never played a Zelda game before. So I'll say, oh, you should definitely pick up and play Wind Waker. But when I was a kid, I think I wasn't entirely captured by the sort of pirate theming and sailing. And I also thought, I think the ocean felt a little empty, which again is like just a totally subjective thing, but that was just the impression that I got. And then Twilight Princess came out, and what happened with that was that I got a Wii as a present for, I think it was Christmas one of the years, and I think this is when I was 14, I think, or I could have been 13 or 14, and I got the Wii, and I either along with it I got Twilight Princess or very very shortly after I got it, and I loved it immediately. It and this comparison is drawn very often, the comparison between Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time. Some people have made criticisms of it saying like, oh, isn't Twilight Princess just a remake of Ocarina of Time, which I think is a little unfair, to be honest. Um, it's a remake as much as any Zelda game is a remake of any other Zelda game. They have a formula and a setting and a world that they're set in, but when I played it, I just saw this all of the magic that was in Ocarina of Time, but it had aged with me. It had become a little bit more mature and a little bit darker. And like I said earlier, I've always kind of been terrified of, but also loved horror. And I've always loved the kind of magic and fantasy elements of Twilight Princess. So it just had me from like the opening, and I played it right through. I didn't rush through it though. I'm a very slow player, and I took a couple weeks to play through it. But I look forward to it every day, and yeah, it's indelibly burnt into my brain like Ocarina of Time is.
Hmm. Well, that answers my next question about whether it was the GameCube or Wii version anyway. So,
It
um,
was, yeah, it was the
but
Wii version, but it was very weird for me to see the GameCube version because I knew it came out on GameCube, but I was like, but then I saw it and I was like, what is this? It's totally mirror image, the whole game, like literally flipped. Because of this sword mechanic, I think is why they did that.
hmm.
And it's just so bizarre to see a space that you existed in when you were younger, like totally flipped. It's quite bizarre. It's like imagine seeing a mirror image of your whole world. It's very
Hmm.
odd.
Um, the thing that sort of sticks out for me is obviously if you had played the Wii version, which you did, is how the motion controls sort of played a factor in it. Like, how did you find them?
So I kind of love motion controls, which again is a very unpopular opinion.
Yeah.
I do. I like the motion controls in Twilight Princess, and I really like them in Skyward Sword. And anyone that has an issue with that can come and fight
Oh
me.
wow, Skyward Sword! Now you're just actually asking for
No, I'm
people's
baiting them
opinion.
on purpose. Like, bring it on. I enjoy this. It gives me energy. But no, I did really like it in Twilight Princess. I totally understand the criticisms of motion controls, especially in Skyward Sword, because I know it alienated a lot of people,
Mm,
especially like accessibility wise. It's not very accessible for a lot of people. So
mm,
I actually totally understand that criticism. I get people just not liking motion controls. I just happen to really love them. I particularly like them in Twilight Princess because it's more gestural than anything. It's not like one to one, which in itself is quite cool. But to sort of flick your wrist and have like Link in front of you do this unbelievably amazing flourish makes you feel very cool. Kind of that like Guitar Hero effect where you're imagining yourself and you're like, oh my god, I look so cool right now. And then if you actually reflected a mirror on yourself, you'd be so embarrassed by how incredibly
yes.
like weak you look. But no, I really liked it. I really liked the motion controls.
What out of curiosity, what other sort of motion games sort of stand out for you in terms of thinking, oh, I really like these, especially in motion controls anyway.
Motion controls. Let me think. One that does kind of stick out to me is I did have Trauma Center for the
Uh,
Wii. I don't know if people know Trauma. Yeah, Trauma Center. It's like a surgery simulator kind of game with a little bit of like narrative going on in the background. It's quite a silly game,
mm.
but
Comes from the team
that's
behind Persona anyway, like the exact team
yeah, yeah.
behind Persona anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And but it's and that sort of sticks out to me as something that I quite liked. But I've always kind of been a bit of a fan, and I'll talk about this a little tiny bit in my honorable mentions. But I've always been quite a fan of like novel control schemes and stuff that kind of messes with your expectation of things. Like I said, I quite liked Guitar Hero for a while. I played that quite a lot when I was younger. Even though I was terrible, almost objectively terrible at it, but I enjoyed it. And that's the most important thing. But other like motion control wise, I mean, I always loved like Wii Sports and stuff as well. Like obviously I got the Wii, so I think it came with it, or it was a huge selling point when it came out originally. So I really enjoyed that. Um, I can't think now what else. What other motion control games were there? I'm sure if I think about it for a bit, I remember. Oh, I had one. This is actually an interesting one, which is I used to play Zack and Wiki. Again, I don't know if you know Zack and Wiki, which is a quite an odd puzzle game. I couldn't tell you really much of anything about it except that it has like quite an odd
It
mechanic
rings
where
a
it kind of
bell. It
sets.
rings a bell anyway.
Yeah, it sort of sets in front of you this sort of, it feels almost miniature, like this big setup of like a problem that you have to solve that sometimes it has a ticking clock or sometimes it's, just kind of a problem that you have. And it just sets you there and it's like, go try to solve this puzzle. But it has multiple ways of solving every puzzle and scores you based on how well you do. But it involves motion controls. It involves stuff like carefully pulling something out of a wall or like shaking something a particular way. And I don't know if the motion controls were used excellently in that, but it's certainly an interesting game to play.
I just checked up on Zack and Wiki, and I know exactly what one you're on about.
Yeah,
Capcom, exactly. I
yeah,
couldn't.
yeah. But it's actually, I think that's an underrated game. So if you can get Zack and Wiki and play it, anyone who's listening, I would. It's quite an interesting game.
Hmm. Um. So, how did you find the story then within Twilight Princess? Because obviously, all of the games are sort of standalone in their own right, but like they definitely have from what I remember of what I've played of Twilight Princess anyway, and admittedly it's not very much, certainly not as much as compared to even Wind Waker, let alone Breath of the Wild. Because I've said this before on the show, I only played like a combined 10 hours of the Zelda series pre Breath of the Wild, of Ocarina on 3DS, Wind Waker on the Wii U, and Twilight Princess on Wii, basically. And I've obviously played a lot more now, significantly thanks to Breath of the Wild. But like each story also has its own themes and all that. There, like they're basically sort of save Hyrule, save
Oh, it has a narrative formula for sure.
yeah, it definitely
Yeah,
has that sort of tropey formula,
yeah.
but they have their own different themes. And from what I remember, what I played of Twilight Princess anyway, it's very it's safe to say, like, and we sort of alluded to this. It's dark.
Yeah, it is kind of dark. I mean, it's, starts, I mean, I say it starts, but like, I mean, okay, so this is one of the negatives that people quote very often. I totally see this, which it has quite a slow opening. Now, when I was younger, I really liked it because, like I said, I've always kind of been an anxious gamer,
Mm.
and someone who, like, if I'm not in games to be anxious. I don't like things to be really incredibly punishing. So when I went into it, I was like, "Ooh, this is like a nice slow opener," and like it had quite a kind of cinematic sort of aspect to it, and that put a lot of people off who were like, "Where is the action? Get me to the action." Which again, I totally understand, but I really loved it, and it set this like starting area of like Orden Village and all these villagers and everything, and it was so pleasant. Like I've never seen such a like pleasant like basic opener for a game. It actually like inspired a couple of smaller projects of mine. I've kind of have the thing about like safe starting areas in games that are like
Mm.
just such a warm, pleasant atmosphere, and just so they can ruin it. That's why they set that up, because game developers hate humans. This is a known fact. So basically, it you come out of the gate basically with child kidnapping. So like that's incredibly dark. There's in this game. I mean, by the way, I will like. I hope it's okay that I'm generally going to be like spoiling the hell out of
Oh
Twilight
fuck! It's a
Princess.
16-year-old
Yeah,
game at
this is
this
the thing is I
point.
think if people were going to play Twilight Princess, they would. I mean, hopefully not. Hopefully some people will listen to this and maybe go and attempt in some way to pick up Twilight Princess and play it. But there's like this kind of this child kidnapping. There's a lot of possession. There's a lot of failure. There's a lot of acceptance of like this is a terrible situation and we just accept it, because this is what's being put in front of us. There's kind of a big emphasis on like loneliness and loss of safety and homeland, and like there's a lot of that. I mean, you see that scattered through the Zelda games, but I think it
Mm.
is about emphasis, and I think it's about the things that it's put with the time that's given. If you have a hard tone change in a movie, it's something that a lot of people will point out. They say, God, they went from that like very dark scene to comedy very fast. And I think this game gives a lot of time to really feel very dark moments in cutscenes and narrative and character moments. It seems like an unimportant thing, but I think it really does have an effect. And again, it could annoy some gamers. Like if you're playing and you're like, I think there's something like a 20-minute lead in before there's actual interactivity, and then again there's like another huge break before there's any actual combat.
So
So
basically, it's what can otherwise be described as Kojimism, basically.
yeah, essentially that's a really good comparison actually. Yeah, kind of, but I think it does give, even if it's somewhat clumsy sometimes, I think it does give a sense that there's a respect for storytelling in something like this. And I think it's a big part of why people love Zelda games, is because the story is not the most original or challenging, but it's very sincere, I think. And I think a lot of people pick up on that. And I think the fact that they care so much about the gameplay and it's so tight and it's so well designed, and then there's a sincerity to the narrative, those two things by themselves might not appear very strong. But again, like, and I think this is really important to emphasize, I think Zelda games, and the reason so many people say that they're their favorite games, is that they're more than the sum of their parts. Everything comes together so well in these games that they leave such an impact on people. And so many other games do so many things that are in all these Zelda games. They do really, really strong puzzles, or really strong story, or interesting characters, or identifiable formulas, or beautiful visuals. But when something nails all those things together and they feel cohesive, you never forget it.
Mm. Um, I want to touch upon that much later on, but like in terms of the sort of themes that you sort of mentioned there, especially with the emphasis on things like loneliness and stuff like that there, like how do you think games like Zelda sort of have a handle on those sorts of things anyway?
Like how they express that kind of
Yes,
theme. I mean,
yes.
I think a lot of it, I mean, like we can talk about the one really obvious thing that a lot of people talked about at the time, which was the visuals. You know, a lot of people, some people complained, some people complimented it, that it was a lot darker because it was followed up, like it followed right after Wind Waker. And that is a hard tone change, like I
Oh, it
mentioned
is.
earlier, you know, and I think a lot of people saw that. And what's interesting about that is, in and of itself, you know, that kind of grim dark thing, it's something people complain about. And I totally, I myself have been someone who's complained about that in the past. But when you have something like Zelda that I think is very, it's very fairy tale like, it's very folklore like, kind of evokes a lot of childhood concepts. It can work really well to pick a primary theme and then like sort of complementary elements throughout it. So they made the Zelda game dark at its core, which meant that all of these really nice, pleasant moments and all these like supportive moments and all these positive character moments really stand up against how things are presented. So the dark stuff that's in this game, in my opinion, like stands out so much more than dark stuff included in other Zelda games. Like there's actually a really, really dark ending, if I remember correctly, to Wind Waker. There's like a speech that like Ganon gives about his homeland being destroyed and them stealing his homeland. But it's like it's oddly juxtaposed against like how bright and happy and positive and cell shaded and cartoony everything is, which for some people is an appeal aspect, you know. But for me, for this game, it's, you know, when you take this riding through Hyrule, for instance, or Hyrule Fields, and you're on horseback, if that's like very cartoony and there's very bubbly music playing in the background, it feels one way. And if you change, I mean, you've seen this in, you know, it's like a basic rule of audio design. It's like if you change that music to something in a minor key or something sadder, it takes on a whole different emotion that like traveling across, you know, this sort of like broad, wide open field can feel very different. So I do think audio is a big part of that. And I think
It changes
um,
a big facet of what it could be telling just by that single
huge,
change in audio.
huge, yeah. And yeah, I think that, and again, personally, I think that Twilight Princess has some of the best music in any Zelda game because it has for a lot of familiar tunes, but a lot of the stuff is just, it stands out so much. So like Midna's lament is so sad and beautiful, you know. And I listen to the Lake Hylia theme from Twilight Princess multiple times a week, every week, just as like one of my chill out like songs that I put in the background to like really really mellow me out. The music that play, the music, I don't even know if you can call it music, or the sounds that play when like you fight Twilight beasts, is like really unnerving. It's that kind of music concrete, almost like dissonant sounds, and it's very uncanny. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, honestly, Silent Hill 2, a little bit, you know. It's got that kind of uncanny aspect to it at times, and it goes so extreme at different points of like humor and cuteness and darkness that it just really hits a chord for me personally.
Mm. I A Silent Hill comparison with Zelda. Never heard that before. I'm not being ironic when I say that. I'm not being flip when I say that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I kind of probably played the two of them near enough around the same time, actually. And like, you know, Silent Hill 2 is one of my other favorite games. I know a lot of people that know me that listen to this podcast are going to be really, really surprised that I'm not talking about Silent Hill 2. Um, but I love aspects of yeah, like it's funny to say, but I love aspects of Twilight Princess for similar reasons to why I love Silent Hill 2. You know, it's got that sense of like loneliness of being trapped in, I don't know, sort of with the risk of being sounding extremely dramatic, the kind of sins of the past, sins of ambition that sort of come across in this Zelda, and that's present in all Zelda games. You know, it's sort of a, oh, I don't want to say the phrase. I'm a game writer. I can't say the phrase. They're like,
say
you know,
the
it's almost like
phrase, Bart.
a person who's very important traveling through the land to complete some kind of important quest. Um, but
Yeah.
it does that. I mean, listen, lots of people critique that, but it has an appeal for a reason. It's brought up many times for a reason. And I think if you, like I said, if you ace every aspect of that really, really well, oh, nothing feels like that. It's like, you know, it's like what they do on cooking shows. You know, if you like, it's better to like make it absolutely perfect, you know, loaf of bread than it is to like fail dramatically at a lava cake. You know, it can be truly something amazing, I think, if you nail every aspect of that story.
Hmm. Um, Twilight Princess big party trick is one that I did not progress far enough into the sort of witness firsthand. But the Twilight realm and sort of transformation into Wolf Link, basically, for the lack of a
Yeah.
better expression. Talk to me about that, because like again, I've not played that far into the game at all. They sort of experienced that firsthand, but it is such a I don't want to say controversial aspect of the game, because like I remember that being sort of front and center to what the game was about at the time. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an odd thing to I sort of emphasize, I suppose. I mean, it's really interesting to see the mechanics shift up and change. And there is like this weird feeling when you're playing as like a wolf in this game that you're I can't think of another word now, so now I have to say it feels sort of like neutered, or sort of like you've had all these like abilities that you have around you, all these items and stuff removed from you, and you feel sort of vulnerable, and you feel, I mean, I did when I played, is like I felt like, oh, I gotta get out of this form immediately. This is terrible. This is like an infliction, and I gotta run through to do whatever I have to do to get out of this state that I'm in. But honestly, I have to say, like the second you turn into Wolf Link in this in Twilight Princess, you meet Midna, and I didn't really focus too much on my wolf form because I was too busy absolutely loving Midna as a character. It's one of my favorite aspects of Twilight Princess. She's just I do think it's kind of sad that following on from that game, I think Midna was a huge appeal of that, and I think a lot of people loved her. I don't know why they didn't invest a little bit more into side characters from that point on, because I think they were always quite weak. And Midna's the one time that I actually point out that it's a very strong character. Um, Maybe that was a little bit of influence from seeing. I've probably actually this probably came out after, but I was just thinking about Jack and Daxter, and just it feels a little bit similar to that in ways. But she's such a sarcastic, interesting character, and I think that kind of tone of like, God, I'm very reluctantly dealing with you like throughout this whole ordeal, but also we're both going through this at the same time is just so appealing. And her like visual design is amazing, and actually, again, one of those things where it's sort of a combination of like appeal and unnerving visuals is sort of very early on. Like she like rides your back when you're in wolf form, which is also incredibly cool idea visually. But when you first approach something that's like interactive, her hair like comes out of her head, becomes a giant claw, and like prepares to like grab onto things and interact with things. And that's like such an unnerving concept. And Link just kind of goes along with it and is, totally fine with it. And
Sure,
it's
fine. This is what it is.
this is just what the situation I'm in. What am I going to do? Complain about it? I can't even speak. But it's I couldn't speak. I couldn't speak before. What am I going to do now? Uh, but yeah, and so like I love her character, and I think it's an incredibly interesting aspect of this. And she has her own arc and motivations and stuff going on behind what she's doing as well. And I think that's really interesting.
Hmm.
So the
Oh.
Legend of Midna, Twilight Princess.
Oh, if only, if only. I feel like the way you're describing her is like, because in Zelda games, there's always a variety of, in some form or another, a trio of Link, Zelda, Ganon, or Ganondorf. Now
For sure, yeah.
you have basically, isn't it? Basically.
Yeah, for sure. I actually think that that's a little sad, to be honest. I'd like to see more variety in those characters, because the roles can always be there. Like you don't have to sacrifice a formula that you like for these kind of characters to be recurring. Although I have to say, like when I was younger, I always used to rename Link like Ellen when I was a kid. So uh, so to me that was like me as a main character, and then these other characters around me. But I do actually think, and this is another thing I have a kind of a bit of a strong opinion on, is I loved Zant. I thought Zant was a really, really cool villain in Twilight Princess. I thought he was like intimidating and different and had, very strong motivation on his own. And it kind of annoyed me at the end. Big spoiler. It kind of annoyed me at the end when it's like, oh, he's just, this kind of secondary. I know this does happen in other Zelda games, that he's this secondary villain to Ganon, which was quite sad to see. And he turns into this kind of silly. It's like a joke reveal where it's like, oh, he's actually really silly and embarrassing and over the top and dramatic. Which over the top and dramatic is fine, but this kind of very, very over the top, like he's played as a joke character, as a reveal. And I think that's quite weak, because I thought he was quite a strong character to begin with. And I would like to see more varied villains with more varied motivations around in future Zelda games, and more varied companion characters as well. Um, yeah, I'd like to see that as a bit of a change up to the formula.
Hmm. Um. So talk to me then about some of the quest mission and design. Like from from what I was reading up earlier today before we came on here, it feels like looking through some of the stuff that I've seen sort of written about it online. It feels like some of the sort of quest design now it sort of feels like this may be a sort of insult in a way. It's not intended as such, but it feels like sort of stringlined a little bit, if that makes sense.
String like linear.
Like not even linear, like sort of well, yes, but stringlined as in to say this was sort of one of the examples that I sort of read when sort of looking up the HD version that came out a few years ago. Like you would catch a fish in order to lure a cat to please its owner in order to buy a slingshot. And I think
Yeah,
this was at the start of the game.
yeah. The start of the game especially has this problem where it does feel entirely linear. And I do, like I said before, I like linear experiences. I like bespoke stuff. I like ordered experiences. It's one of the things I wasn't as keen on in Breath of the Wild. And again, I only say that as a comparison to Zelda games, not as a game on its own, which I think is unbelievable, fantastic, incredibly impressive. I played through almost the entire thing. I have this issue with games where if I get like really, really, really into them, I'll be kind of not want to play the ending on purpose because it makes me kind of sad to finish it. So I have that issue with a couple of games. So I did that with Breath of the Wild where I enjoyed it so much that I was like, I can't, how can I? Also, I was scared to play it as well, the ending. But no, it was so yeah, I for sure see that, especially the beginning. And this is part of the problem with the opening, which I said I love, but I actually think it's quite a risky move because I know you're going to lose so many people who are very interested in decision making and immediate and have a huge emphasis on interactivity. You're going to lose them really, really quickly because it's a really long opener, And if you're someone who like really enjoys that kind of emotional experience and storytelling, then I think you're going to be fine. But if you want to pick up a sword and swing it from the second you start, it's going to be a barrier to entry for you. I do think that lessens up later in the game. I think that the dungeons, which I love so much, which is a big part of why I love Zelda games, is the dungeons in Twilight Princess are fantastic. They're some of the best designed dungeons, I think. And they have that really satisfying feeling of, I think, so this is not my word that I came up with. I can't remember who said it, but I think a game designer or possibly a game journalist said it. They said these dungeons in Zelda games in general have this really nice feeling of like slowly and surely untying a knot, and it feels very, very satisfying. And I think that these games maintain that, and they do have that kind of side quest aspect to it. They do have a lot of like travel and traversal, but definitely not nowhere near as much as Breath of the Wild. I wouldn't even say almost as much as Skyward Sword. There's actually one of my criticisms I would have of Twilight Princess is that they could have done with a few more side quests, to be honest. There's kind of really just like there's bug collection. There's a couple of like specific side quests, like the Giovanni kind of freedom side quest, and there's like Mallow Mart stuff. But for the most part, yeah, it's quite a linear experience. But I think that really comes down to maybe preference. It's like, are you the kind of person that really, really wants to play a completely open world game with like a lot of freedom and decision making, which I also love. Like I'm replaying The Witcher 3 right now, and that's part of the main reason why I love it. Like I kind of reluctantly do the main quest in that, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I think that the kind of paced aspect of it is one of the things I love about Twilight Princess.
What is it about something something you said there? What is it about Zelda games that make it feel what was it you said? Easy to sort of unwind to, I think in terms
Yeah,
of the
that sort
mission
of
design.
untying of a knot.
Yeah,
Again, not
yeah,
my
untying.
phrase.
Yeah. Well, but
But
what is it
like,
about it that makes it
yeah,
feel so worthwhile anyway?
yeah. I mean, it kind of depends. Like if you think about it, like one of the ways I like to think about it is you break it down into like smaller and smaller parts, and the
Hmm.
way that I think that they segment their gameplay experiences feels incredibly satisfying because the human brain, we can only absorb so much information and so
Yeah.
much puzzle at a time. And so Zelda stuff, I mean, a lot of people will actually say this, that Zelda's actually really easy, and personally, I'm not, when I play games, and this again depends on your player, but like when I play games, I'm not looking for a punishing experience. I'm looking for that really, really nice, solid walk the line balance between, challenge and reward, that sort of, thing where you walk into a room and there's a locked door in front of you, and an eye that opens, a metallic eye that opens just above it. And this actually a small puzzle from Skyward Sword. And there's a raised platform in the center of the room, and you kind of like you walk around and you're like, like what? How am I supposed to get through this door? You look for keys, you look for chests. There's nothing in this room at all. You walk up to the platform and the eye opens. And you're like, okay, like am I meant to stab it or shoot it or something? You try everything, and you're like, there's nothing. You take out your sword, and it's one-to-one motion controls in Skyward Sword. So you move the sword like this. You notice that the eye is following the sword,
Hmm.
and you swoop back and forth like a couple of times, nothing happens, and then eventually you realize, oh, if you do this, it spins and it gets dizzy, breaks, and falls down, and the door opens. And it's that thing, if you walk in a room, there's a very, very obvious problem, there's a very obvious question, and there's a really kind of outside the box way of solving that puzzle, and that feels incredibly satisfying. And there's a nice balance between that kind of novel, I have no idea how to solve this, and sort of familiar things like block moving puzzles, or room traversal puzzles, or water level puzzles that you walk in and you recognize, but you don't necessarily know how to unravel that at any one moment. So I suppose if I had to put it down to one word, I'd probably say novelty. If they keep things fresh and changed up enough, and you slowly increase the difficulty, maybe bring back some stuff that you saw way earlier, and kind of flip back and forth between all those different things, creates this amazing sense of, I am a genius. You're the same as anyone else playing a Zelda game. You're slowly picking apart this knot. Picking apart a knot does not take genius to do, but it feels incredibly satisfying.
Hmm.
you know and I think that that's a big part of it, is that it's balance, and it's a lot of different little things that add together. Again, it's more than the sum of its parts, the experience. So I think there's a lot of really interesting design lessons to be learned from Zelda games. Twilight Princess just happens to be my favorite, but there's lots of interesting stuff to see in all these kinds of games.
I feel like a lot of these Zelda games, certainly from Ocarina onwards, at least in terms of a modern equivalent, like they do feel like they impart a lot of different design lessons. And I think you actually sort of alluded to one there, Ellen, in terms of if you go into Twilight Princess as a sort of straight up action game from the very beginning, it's not going to go sort of well to
Yeah,
but whereas with Breath of the Wild, you're just sort of thrust out into the world from the very beginning by Nintendo, and you just go, right, here's what, no, not even that, just like, okay, here's the world. Go
yeah,
nuts. That's not even the world. It's literally just the opening plateau of the game.
yeah,
But like that plateau is still bigger than a majority of open worlds you'd see in games today. And in that aspect, you're open to sort of go and do whatever the hell you want. And if that
yeah.
means, you know, go off attacking from the offset, then happy fucking birthday to you, friend. You can get to do that. So like, there's not necessarily a question to that. It's just something that I sort of picked up on in terms of what you were saying. But like, I think in terms of a designer perspective, anyway, like there's definitely Zelda games where you can sort of take away different lessons from each game, anyway.
For sure, absolutely. And there's different priorities for different kinds of players met, I think, by a variety of different Zelda games. And you can see that in how passionately people will, announce their favorite games. They'll say like Wind Waker is absolutely my favorite Zelda game. And maybe those people are like really into thematic adventures, and then someone will say Breath of the Wild is my favorite Zelda game, and someone's really into freedom and creative problem solving and combat mechanics. And then, someone might say Twilight Princess, and they might be, um, desperately anxious all of the time and need some way of expressing that. No, I'm just kidding. But like, it's really interesting to see the different ways that designers over at Nintendo have sort of interpreted and experimented and explored with each of these Zelda games, which I think they all take a bit of a risk, which is why I think people feel so strongly. Like we often joke, at the start of this podcast about, oh no, the Ocarina of Time fans are coming after me, or, and then I think this is because, people feel very, very passionate about it because it does something that games that are designed for everyone cannot do necessarily, which is kind of hit that incredibly specific niche sweet spot for a lot of people, and it's quite successfully done in Zelda games, I think.
Hmm. Um, so we sort of talked about it there, but like specifically, like let's delve into a little more the dungeon design because obviously a key factor, if not the key factor, around Zelda games. Like, what were your sort of memories from that anyway?
Oh, from Twilight Princess specifically, I
Yeah.
mean, I love the dungeons in Twilight Princess. I have a lot of like good memories. Like one that really like comes to mind is Snow Peak Ruins, which is sort of the mountainous, snowy sort of dungeon. And it's funny because like when I think of dungeons in Zelda games, when I think of thematic dungeons, like I think of there's usually like an ice dungeon, there's usually a fire dungeon, desert, there's usually a forest one. There's settings that I prefer. So like I prefer to spend time in a forest setting. Like my brain likes grass and trees, so I kind of fear sort of water levels and ice levels in general. But Snow Peak Ruins is so interestingly like the thematics of it is done so well. So it's basically like someone's house. It's essentially done up like a manor, like this couple's sort of castle slash manor, and it feels like you're in someone's house solving these kind of puzzles. And it's overall like this Twilight Princess, I think even more so than any of the Zelda games, very puzzly. It has a lot of puzzle mechanics. There are a lot of different ones. It kind of feels like they pulled out like every possible thing they could have thought of to do with a puzzle. And so I particularly love that. Like the boss combat in the Snow Peak Ruins is against the wife of the man that you're helping, and she turns into this like terrifying demon thing, which by the way is another example of like that that horror included in Twilight Princess. It's a really big jump scare when you walk in. You're like, oh, it's that nice little it's a nice little woman that I was helping earlier, and she turns around like full 360 head turn and a big loud like kind of orchestra sting and this like demonic face, and like 14-year-old me is, oh god. And then you have to fight her, and you have to look in the floor as a giant mirror, to hit her down off the ceiling and to know where she's going to land so that she doesn't crush you and kill you. And it's like, it's so exciting, but also like very thematic and very well done. And another one that I really love is Arbiter's Grounds, which is brought up a lot by Twilight Princess fans as a big one that they love, because it's got such an amazing sense of adventure to it, but also again, it's really quite horrifying because it's very dark. There's a lot of quicksand. There's a lot of ghosts and demons. There's the Redeads or Gibdo, depending on who you ask, kind of haunting the place. And those Redeads are terrifying. Like they very slowly move towards you, with these huge, strong attacks, and they freeze you in place as well. And there's nothing you can do, and that's terrifying, but there's a lot of like bow and arrow, shooting from a huge distance at a sniper in a crow's nest throughout Arbiter's Grounds, around the outside of it. And it's just incredibly satisfying. Like you feel like Indiana Jones going through Arbiter's Grounds, I think. And that's incredibly satisfying. And then you got, Castle in the Sky is unbelievable because you're traversing it again with these double claw shot, which like everyone loves the claw shot, in Zelda games. It's so satisfying. We all just want one in real life. But you're traversing it with this double claw shot, and there's a lot of like really, really clever puzzle mechanics about like lowering yourself into areas that you would assume you would be able to get to, vertically by climbing, and the floor is falling away, and that again is kind of terrifying. And then there's a lot of other sort of interesting ideas and mechanics and to do with theming dungeons. So like one is Temple of Time, I think it is. And I hope I'm not confusing this with City in the Sky, but I think Temple of Time is you enter it. It's like an old, broken down, ruined temple, and you bring it back from the past, and you enter it, and it's beautiful, gleaming, and it's all tile and gold and metal. And as you move through it, there's like these automaton robots attacking you, again, moving very slowly and providing these huge wallops, which is innately terrifying. And you see these throughout it, and you move through it, and you get to the boss room, and you step in. And like while you're moving through it, you're also seeing like some Lizalfos and some spiders as well, which terrify me automatically anyway. And then you move into the final boss room, and you see these kind of broken down automatons in the corner. You're like, oh, I'm going to fight these giant robots. And then when you step in, they don't do anything. And you have this cutscene moment where Link's like, what's going on? And then looks up and sees a giant, creepy, like hairy spider boss, essentially the big Goma boss on the ceiling.
God, I did not play any more of that game, because I would have tossed it. No, I wouldn't have tossed it. I would have snapped it in half. Then I would have thrown it like a fucking frisbee.
I always had like terrible arachnophobia as well from when I was a kid. So like that scared the living bejesus out of me, like so badly. But it was great because it really got me, because you totally expect, because the mini boss is like a knight. and they're very themed of the kind of dungeon that you're in. So it's really, there's some really interesting use of a combination of design and messing with players' expectations through theming, which I think is really interesting.
Like a layer of subversion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something that we underuse in game design, is that using the narrative story setting to kind of complement the design that's happening in the basic mechanics. There's a huge divide there, I think, between narrative and gameplay, that if we combine those more often and we worked through them more often from the very start of a game through the very end, we could get some really interesting stuff happening. And I think that's one of the reasons why Zelda sticks out in so many people's minds as like a very, very strong example of their own personal favorite experiences playing games.
Um, so the Zelda games, they have a sort of through line in terms of how they look anyway, like art style and all that there. Like you sort of alluded to it earlier, but like the transition, for example, from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess is incredibly jarring. Like the art design in Wind Waker is so it's cel shaded, cartoony, but absolutely beautiful, and is definitely, if people say that's the reason why Wind Waker is their favorite game, I would go, you know what? Fair play, fair
For
play.
sure, yeah.
I would
Totally
get
makes
it. I
sense.
would get it because like it's beautiful, so beautiful,
Stunning. Yeah.
stunning. But like you say, like going from that to sort of this realistic look within Twilight Princess, it is such a jarring transition, and then even just sort of to go from there, like Skyward Sword, sort of half realistic, half sort of cartoony. I wouldn't say cel shaded necessarily
It
with it.
almost feels kind of watercolor. There's a bit of a
Yeah,
like a watercolor
that's
inspiration
exactly
in
the
Skyward
description I was
Sword.
gonna say. I just didn't know if it was the right one, but
Mm.
that's exactly it. And then you get things like Breath of the Wild, which is a lot more, not necessarily cartoon, not necessarily realistic, but it's more self. No, not. I don't even know what to call Breath of the
I
Wild,
think it might be considered cell shaded Breath of the
but
Wild. I mean, technically, which what does that really mean when it
I
comes to
mean, it's
visual
not
design?
realistic. I can definitely see
Yeah,
that, but like,
yeah.
there's an element of realism to it, with the majority of it being sort of self shaded, and then the Link's Awakening remake that came out a few years ago for the Switch, that was definitely more in line of
It's like toy-like
Twilight,
almost.
exactly Twilight,
Yeah.
and so with Twilight Princess in particular, anyway, like the the look of the game anyway, like it certainly fits with the darker aspect of it anyway.
Yeah, but I like, and then like I said, people bring up the dark visuals of that game an awful lot, but I think it's easy to see. You could see almost anything as dark compared to Wind Waker. Like Wind Waker is
Hmm.
possibly an example of one of the most vibrant, bright, cartoon like cell shade, traditional cell shaded that you could possibly like imagine as an example. Like if you wanted to give an example that was an extreme, Wind Waker is a perfect example of that. So I feel like it was almost unfortunate to follow it up with Twilight Princess. I mean, if you compare Twilight Princess to a couple of other like grimdark kind of visual stuff, I think it probably people would be calling it cartoony, which is kind of funny,
Hmm.
because it definitely has a lot of like cartoony aspects to how characters are proportioned and how lighting is done and how you know even how doors are shaped. It's like it's quite funky and odd as well at times. Um, and I think it's funny because, like I said before, if you have something that really theme, visual theme, narrative theme is decided by what you are the majority of the time. So when you take something like Twilight Princess and it's kind of darker the majority of the time, when you come in with something bright and colorful, or something funny, or something like I mentioned earlier about Orden Village at the beginning of the game, it's very warm. There's a lot of like blues in the water. There's a lot of green grass and orange pumpkins, and there's a lot of like firelight and things like that in the game. And I thought that was very like bright and warm. I mean, I do think it could honestly, like the original version, I think was maybe the saturation was pumped up a little bit for the HD version, because I did play the HD version, but it's hard without a direct comparison to know exactly how far they pushed it. I think they could have pushed it a little bit more, but I quite like that kind of darker aesthetic to it. And I like the moments where they get to pull it back up a little bit to a brighter place. And then when they push it darker, whoa, like Arbiter's Grounds feels like a horror game when you play it, just because it's so visually, literally dark, as in shadows, dark as in, the tones of the colors, and then thematically, I just think it matches really, really well, personally.
Hmm. And the funny thing that I just remembered is I mentioned that sort of jarring transition from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess. There was a lot of fan uproar to the transition from the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask era to what would become Wind Waker, basically. So,
I do actually remember. It's funny because like I didn't play it. I mean, I played it when it came out, but like a
alright.
while after. But when I remember when it came out, because I was one of those kids at the time who read like gaming magazines,
Oh yeah.
and I do remember at the time people being like, "This is a Zelda game. Like, what is this? Is like is it for small children?" And it's such an odd kind of. I mean, it makes sense in that they'd set kind of a standard and then they really changed it up. It was a huge style jump to Wind Waker. But this is one of the things that I love about Zelda as a series is that they're really willing to just absolutely throw caution to the wind and take some real chances with it. And sometimes, and that this is something that Nintendo does on a larger scale as well with things like the Wii U as well. They'll look at something and be like, what is really novel and different and challenging and kind of weird, and like let's go for that. Let's take a chance on it because we have a lot of space to move. It's not like one thing is going to destroy this entire IP. And I think that attitude's paid off for them, I think.
Oh yeah.
So, it's one of my favorite things is that there's so many of these kinds of Zelda games that they have a formula, but they deviate in very specific ways from that formula that give so much to so many people. And so it's great to see, things like Wind Waker and things like Twilight Princess. And I can go and recommend both of those to people and different people or the same people. And people love both. It's incredibly cool.
Hmm. Um. So specifically then on that sort of darker aspect of Twilight Princess, because like we sort of talked about it and alluded to it, but like um I mentioned this to you before we actually started properly recording, but it feels like to me that Twilight Princess, besides Majora, was Twilight Princess feels like a darker Zelda game than any modern Zelda game that's come before it or after it, with the exception of Majora and maybe the upcoming Breath of the Wild sequel. But um, you don't quite necessarily agree with that.
Well, I mean, personally, like I said when I was young, and what I'm talking about now is
Hmm.
Ocarina of Time, which I think is an incredibly dark game. I think that I played it when I was, like I mentioned before, when I was like 5 or 6. I watched my mom play it, and then I put into my brain the things that I could absorb at the time when I was a kid. So the things that went into my brain were like, ooh, magic, ooh, reward, ooh, puzzle solving, and then ooh, Jesus, scary themes and like terrifying monsters and threats. And then when I got older, I went back and played it again, and it's so sad. I mean, a lot of people who are fans of the Zelda series in general and Ocarina of Time more specifically have talked about the themes of like loss of childhood, about being like wrenched out of it by things that happen to you that are out of your control, and having to deal with that simply because you're the kind of person that maybe wants to help people, or you have no choice in it,
Hmm.
and about time slipping away from you, friendships slipping away from you, and like accepting loss. There's so much in Ocarina of Time that's, I suppose, rather than dark, you'd probably call it sad or melancholic.
Yeah.
But there's very serious themes there. I think there's very serious themes in almost all the Zelda games. I mentioned earlier about Wind Waker. There's some very, very serious themes in Wind Waker, and I think that those things are present in Zelda, and I think it just definitely adds to the quality overall. Because it's always interesting to see something that you resonate with reflected in the media that you consume. So I think it's, for me, I do kind of gravitate a little bit towards things that are scarier or things that are sadder, because I feel more connection with those kinds of pieces of media, and I feel a sense of incredible happiness when that's contrasted with a positive moment. I feel like it's really powerful. And I think, like I said, you get that in definitely more games than just Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, which are two games that are often referenced as being very dark, which they definitely are, unquestionably. But I think you see that in a lot of Zelda games.
Hmm. Um. To sort of touch back on something that you said before we started, and you said it a while ago here while we've been going, that Zelda is basically the sum of its parts. Basically, it feels like a very cohesive package. In terms of not only gameplay but its themes, its art style, um, thematically, like I said, themes, but thematically, gameplay wise, and just sort of the art direction and story as well. Like it feels like, again, like you said, as some of its parts. How do you think the Nintendo development team sort of put that together and make it stick? I mean, like there's an
How did
element
they
of
pull off that miracle?
like that. There's an element of that
Yeah.
Nintendo magic,
Yeah.
but like we all know, like it takes a lot more than just magic. They sort of pull everything together, even if you are the mighty Nintendo.
For sure, for sure. One thing that definitely comes to mind immediately, which is a bit like of an unfortunate thing to, have to bring up, is that, they do have a lot of prestige, they have a lot of resources, but more so than that, they're willing to delay their release because they're favoring the quality over the deadline that has been put forward. And that is obviously a massive privilege. Like, most developers and most small indie companies and even some bigger companies can't necessarily afford to do that. But, we've seen, I think that it's kind of an example of how if we loosened up on something like that, if we were able to somehow, you know, prioritize, the quality of a product being brought out rather than the speed at which it's brought out, I think we would have so many more interesting, cohesive experiences. Because like almost, I don't know if there's one that hasn't been, but like almost every Zelda game has been delayed. And every time I hear that, there's like two voices going in my head at one time where I'm like, God damn it, and yes, excellent, brilliant. I'm going to have so much of a better game when it comes out because they've given these, artists and creatives and technical wizards time to put into it and to work together on it so that it's a cohesive thing, and that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. They can ask questions, they can, take concepts and, they don't have to go by that kind of oh, what's the phrase I'm thinking of? They don't have to, follow that sunk cost fallacy of like, we put X amount of time into this one mechanic, we better keep it. They'll go, no, it's not fun. Get rid of it. We have the time because we're Nintendo and we have these resources. We have the time to spend an extra month, 2 months on reworking this and getting it in possibly, so I think that definitely benefits it for sure. I also think that they have clearly, based on the teams that have worked on these projects, a very clear vision for the kinds of players that they're making something for, and the level of difficulty and the sort of tone that they're shooting for with various different cutscenes, segments, gameplay mixed with story. So I imagine there's a great level of collaboration and communication within their offices, I would say.
Mm. But at the same time, and I'm going to use a different example here. You mentioned how Nintendo tends to sort of delay all these games, like in the series. Like for example, we were expecting Breath of the Wild to come out, for example, in 2016,
Yeah,
and they pushed it to 2017, back at the end. Not was it at the end of 2015? I can't
yeah.
mind, but it was something like that. But like,
It was a
yeah,
very long, yeah, for sure.
and I would imagine if not for the pandemic, we probably there. I would still say would Breath of the Wild 2 would have definitely have come out in 2022, but at least without the pandemic, you could maybe have argued a case that they could have put it out for this year anyway. Um, but to give a different example, there's a double-edged sword to sort of delaying everything, maybe, and like feel free to sort of um shoot my head off here, basically, for using this example in comparison to what Nintendo has done with the series with Zelda. Um, for the better part of, I want to say near enough all the games, but certainly especially with their top tier releases over the past 10, 15 years, like every game from Rockstar has been delayed at least once. At least once. Like Grand Theft Auto 4 was meant to come out in October of 07. Got pushed like a little later after its reveal in 06 to 08. Max Payne 2 was meant to come out in 09. Came out in 2012. LA Noir was announced in 2005. Didn't come out until 2010.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
like
that's
this,
some delay. Yeah.
there's so many examples. Like Grand Theft Auto 5, like when it was announced in 2011, like that was meant to come out in the spring of 2013. Came
Yeah.
out September 2013. Um, and then Red Dead Redemption, 2017, nope. Late 2017, nope. Spring 2018, nope. Came out in the fall of 2018, and
Yeah.
that was when sort of brouhaha kicked off about
Yeah.
crunch at Rockstar. And even now, um, the expanded and enhanced edition of Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that has been out for nearly 10 years at this point, revealed 10 years ago, as of about a month ago, uh, for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 and PC, and it's been released over several generations, and that version has been delayed. That
Yeah.
version has been delayed. So the fact that a sort of remaster for a third generation release of a game gets delayed, that sort of tells you a lot. But I think the point I'm trying to make is there may be a double-edged sword to sort of delaying a game.
Oh, I
Because
mean, for sure, one qualifier that I will give to that is that, delaying a game is not like a magic wand that you can wave that will make a
oh
game
yeah,
good. But for sure, I would say that generally speaking, I do lean towards like happiness when I hear a game is delayed. If a game is delayed, it's not delayed for like no reason. It's definitely delayed because the people who are, I mean, and oftentimes delaying a game is not profitable or positive for big investors and big companies. It's not something that they want to hear. If they can push it out broken, they'll push it out broken. So not all the time, but a decent amount of the time, if they can, they will. So that's what brings them in the profits. So I think that generally speaking, when games are delayed, it's really just giving developers more time to get things done. And I think if that's directed in a way that reduces crunch, it's almost always better.
hmm.
Because and the other thing is, you're right in that, like, if they're just extending the amount of time that developers are doing crunch for, I just don't think that's sustainable. I mean, generally speaking, I think it's safe to say the majority of the people in the industry are anti-crunch. There's very few people, usually big company heads, that are pro the concept of crunch at all. I mean, like, I myself know it's not sustainable. It's not a sustainable practice for developers, and it's usually an indicator of poor project planning, in my opinion, as well. If you are planning a project and part of it is unpaid, overworking by people that really don't have much of an option of saying no. I mean, that's terrifying. So, personally, like I said, I generally kind of breathe a sigh of relief when I hear a game's being delayed. But like, it's not a magic wand. It doesn't solve all the problems of development. It doesn't fix things all the time. And it is difficult. One thing I will say about remasters as well is that I've been working over the past year on a remaster, and I think there's a little bit of an underestimation of the work involved in a remaster as well. And if you have, possibly large company heads or investors or stockholders, making suggestions to developers about what should or can be done within the time frame, who have maybe very little knowledge about what is necessarily involved in the process, that can also delay things massively as well. So I mean, maybe one way of solving this, and this is not a magic wand either, is maybe some more transparency between developers and fans and players, to say like at what stages that a process might be in, or reasons why they're delaying. Again, that's not going to work for every project for obvious reasons, but but generally speaking, I'm pro delaying if it's possible. It usually is a good indication of, we're able to put some more time and love and effort into this, which I do like to see generally.
Just to correct myself so very slightly, I said LA Noir came out in 2010. It was actually 2011, so it was actually a 6-year gap.
It's like 1 year longer.
And it's really, so it was a year longer. And that was when the whole Team Bondi brouhaha kicked off as well. So yeah, basically, I think what we're trying to say is games development is very hard.
It's super hard. Oh my god.
I've never done it, and I fucking know how hard it is.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the Wii U remaster, like, how did you find that? Did you actually play it?
I did. I played it right through. I played it. I annoyed every single one of my friends when it came out, and I was so excited. And people were like, "Why are you excited for Twilight Princess?" I'm like, "Have you met me?" So I played through it like the weekend it came out. I canceled things. I am playing Twilight Princess. No, I did. I played through it. I I liked it. Again, it was, they brought up the saturation a little bit, which is like, I'm not going to complain about that. I think it was probably a good call. One thing I really despised in the remake, which is funny thing to say, but like they put in these like Miiverse, or like I can't remember what their social media thing was, or their like platform social media thing. I think it was Miiverse. It could have been
It was
like
Miiverse, yeah.
Weverse or something. And they put in these like stamps in chests in the game that you get, which is infuriating. Like if you're someone playing Zelda, you've done all this work to get to this chest, you open it, you're like, yes, I'm going to get something amazing. Even like, 20 rupees I'd be happy with, but you open it and it's like, you've got this totally out of universe Miiverse stamp. It's awful. I felt so like, I'm not going to use that. It was so painful to get. It's such a weird way. You pulled me right out of this like beautiful narrative I put myself in, where I'm the hero of time, and it's like, no, suddenly I'm collecting Miiverse stamps. It didn't work at all, I don't think. But I think apart from that, there wasn't like many huge changes. There was another section put into the game, but I don't remember it that well. It wasn't the Cave of Ordeals. I think the Cave of Ordeals was in the original, unless I'm forgetting something. But yeah, no, I mean overall it was pretty good. I kind of liked it. I missed the motion controls, which were absent from the Wii U version, or at least in the version I played with the big gamepad.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did miss it.
Did you get the amiibo that has the sort of dungeon in it?
Of course I did, yeah.
No, of course.
But I got that amiibo because I wanted the amiibo. I got the amiibo because I wanted the figurine.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I wanted a I wanted a Midna figurine really badly. I do have like a not insignificant Zelda collection in my house. I'm a well-known Zelda fan, and my partner actually in one of the like earlier gifts earlier in our relationship, carved a master sword for me out of wood and painted it and like presented it to me, because I close my eyes, and he's holding me out this, and it was huge. It was like not my size, but slightly smaller than me, and it was like unbelievable. Like it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. It's hanging on my
at the risk of being
since.
very slightly inappropriate, did you ask him to marry him right then and there?
I should have. I'm actually marrying him very soon. But yeah, no, it was amazing. And he's actually made me a couple of things since then, because he's like a very talented like craftsman, and he's made and that's not his trade. He's actually an economist by trade, but his hobby is craftsman.
That makes it even more impressive.
Yeah, he's a very, very talented person. And he actually also made me a chest from Skyward Sword, which actually holds all my Zelda guidebooks. I'm really, I mean, even on this podcast, I'm outing myself as a nerd now. If that's even, like, it's one level even
Ellen,
higher.
We're a bunch of nerds on this show. I don't know what gave you the impression that we're not.
Okay, and then as well, I also have a that he also that he made me the goddess harp from Skyward Sword as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fuck.
And that's I've a lot of other stuff as well. I have a bit of a Zelda problem. I should probably stop buying Zelda merch at this point.
Fuck. If you were marrying him, I'd fucking marry him, and I'm not even a big, massive Zelda fan. I'd just be impressed at how at an economist just basically being able to craft things like that.
He also, at the risk of making him sound even better, he also makes games in his spare time as well. So he's sort of a hobby game developer as
well. So what else do you like about Twilight Princess that we've not really got into tonight?
God, yeah, I talked about visuals. One thing I really love, and this is kind of it's something that's not noticed as often, I think, in games, and I think is super underrated aspect of game design in general, is the sound effects. I think that a lot of people talk about Twilight Princess. I mean, people that don't like really overtly, critique it, people who like Twilight Princess in general, a lot of people bring up this, like the satisfying feel of playing the game. And I think a huge part of that is the sound effects that are put into the game. Like there's a bit of a short story that one of my lecturers when I was in college told me about a game that they were working on, that they had a weapon in the game that gamers would message in and complain about, and they said it's not strong enough, it's not a good gun, it doesn't do very much damage. And my lecturer said, oh, you know what, maybe change the sound effects and see if they come back and they changed the sound effect to sound a little bit more crunchy or a little bit bigger, a bit louder, a bit more shotgunny. And people came back and said, "Oh my God, this does so much damage now. It's amazing." And they changed nothing about how the gun functioned at all. And I think sound effects have a really like heavy impression on how we feel a gameplay. So like game feel wise, I think sound effects matter hugely. And I think in Breath of the Wild, I mean, Breath of the Wild, that's also true. They have amazing work on sound effects in Breath of the Wild. But in Twilight Princess, they feel very impactful. There's a lot of like, the movement feels amazing. The sounds of traversing something, the wolf sounds that Link makes make everything feel like it's kind of an effort, and he's vicious. Like when he attacks, he makes this like snarling noise. And then Midna's speech is like, garbled English backwards, and she sounds very otherworldly in the context of the game. So it's one really small thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily notice, that is, a part of it that I really love. And again, it does come up in many Zelda games. Like the sound work is unbelievable on these games.
Actually, there's another aspect of the Twilight Princess that you sort of briefly touched on, but I'm sort of surprised at myself that I didn't actually bother to ask, and that is the soundtrack. I
Yeah.
don't think we got to talk about that in detail.
We talked a little bit, so I mentioned some kind of tunes from it that I really love. But I think tonally it's unbelievable. I think it's unparalleled. It's a little sad to me that it's a MIDI sort of synthy soundtrack. I would love it like a full, the full orchestral sound is unbelievable. Like Breath of the Wild, that's one thing about it that's just, I think it's fair to say it's unparalleled. Like the music in that game is unbelievable. My ringtone, actually, when someone calls me, is the Guardian Alert music from Breath of the Wild. Just because that's how I feel when I get a phone call, because I'm an anxious person. So when that music plays, other people go, "Why do you have such an anxious, horrible sound effect when your phone rings?" I said, "Well, that's exactly how I feel."
I can picture
it. But it's amazing. But like in Twilight Princess, I think the music is, again, it nails that kind of, it's melancholic, it's beautiful, it's multi-layered. I listen to it all the time. If you haven't played Twilight Princess, you don't necessarily have to get this small piece of why I think it's really beautiful. You can go on Spotify, I think. I'm not sure actually. Is Nintendo Music on Spotify? They might have had an issue with that. But you can go on YouTube. You can look up the soundtrack. I
don't even know if you can go on YouTube. Fucking
yeah, actually, that's probably worse. Actually,
Nintendo's sort of gone haywire with copyright
they have
stuff
with the copyright stuff. Yeah, and it's pretty sad. Actually, one of the things I was going to mention as a negative for Twilight Princess, if you were to ask me my negatives, which I've already mentioned a few.
Actually, so why did you go into that? What didn't you like about it?
Like this is more of a broader thing, but I think this is really, really a huge negative, which is like, I want to sit on this podcast now and I want to say to people, go play Twilight Princess. That's what I want to be able to say to people. And then people will say to me, cool, how do I get on Switch? It's like, no, you're going to have to dig out a Wii U and get a HD copy, which is already crazy, or you can go and get the Wii, dig out your Wii from your attic or something, or try to buy one secondhand and get the copy if you can find it. Good luck for that, to play it. And that is so sad. I mean, this is really more of a broader issue in games when it comes to archiving, games. We've lost a lot of games with the loss of Flash, and it's just, this is something I feel quite passionate about. I don't know, to be honest, a real catch-all solution to this. It's just so sad. There's so many games that you can now only experience by going on YouTube and watching people's playthroughs. And that's great that we have that. It's great that we have something, but it is quite sad. I'd love to be able to tell people, and it's great to see, something like Skyward Sword come out in HD on the Switch. I'd love to see, Nintendo continually. I mean, it sounds like a lazy thing, but like, I actually would love to see them just keep releasing games that they've made that are excellent and people loved, because like, I want to be able to access them. I don't want to lose access to them. But there's a bigger question, I think, to be asked around digital art formats and cultural products, and how we archive them and how we save them for future generations and future game designers. Because if we keep losing these experiences, less and less designers are going to play them. They're going to learn the lessons less often. They're going to keep reinventing the wheel, as it were, and it'll be hard for our medium to progress over time. So I really do hope that we come up with some kind of solution there. I know there's some people who are working on like larger projects to kind of come up with a solution for archiving games, but yeah, that's one of my. I mean, that's more of a like overall game industry issue, but it is a genuine problem I have because I want to recommend Twilight Princess to people. It's very hard. Um, yeah, so like that's one of my bigger problems. There's also another one that people do mention, and I see it, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, which is some people describe Twilight Princess as kind of empty. I've actually also seen some people, very, very few, not as many people, but some people say this about Breath of the Wild as well, where they've said there's quite a lot of like empty space between things happening. You can feel them placed within the empty space that's been put there. I think that that's kind of a sort of something I don't feel like is a negative or a positive. It's something that's sort of interesting. I think it could have maybe done with some more side quests. I still really like that. It's one of the things I like about Skyward Sword is it has some really, really nice side quests in there, even if a lot of them are kind of sort of pigeonholed in, Skyloft, as it were. But yeah, I feel like it feels a little bit empty at points. I mean, honestly, it's funny, but maybe that kind of reflects the kind of overall theme of that sort of isolation and loneliness and sadness that I mentioned before in Twilight Princess. But yeah, I would like to see what a version of Twilight Princess might look like with more things in it, specifically in like Hyrule Field, which feels a little empty to me.
For what it's worth, when we're recording this at the end of November 2021, and it's actually 2 weeks before the Game Awards. So I'm just going to say, and there are suggestions that Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD are still on for the Switch. So I'm just saying, Game Awards maybe.
I would like to be able to say that Twilight Princess has exactly 0 negatives. Please, Nintendo, if you're listening to this podcast, I would very much like Twilight Princess on my Switch so I don't have to dig my Wii U out of the attic. Now that I've talked about Twilight Princess as much, I absolutely have to play it. I would like to not have to dig through my attic stuff to get to my Wii U to play it. Please release it on the Switch.
Like, basically Zelda 3D All-Stars. Like,
that would actually
Ocarina 3D.
Legitimately make my year.
Ocarina 3D, Majora 3D,
yes.
Wind Waker HD,
can you imagine?
And Twilight Princess HD on top of the recent Skyward Sword HD.
I would have no money. I would pay any amount of money.
Healy, you know what to do, Jeffrey. Come on, Jeffrey, you can do it. Pave the way, put your back
into it.
That's the second time I've referenced Inside this season. It'll be the first time people will hear it, but it'll be the second time I'll have referenced it in terms of recording order anyway. What would you change from a design perspective then from Twilight Princess?
From a design perspective, if I had ultimate control over Twilight Princess, what would I change?
If you were EJ Numa, what would you do?
I was EJ Numa. What would I change? I do feel one of the things that's brought up an awful lot as a negative is the collection of the tiers, which you do in wolf form. You run around kind of areas that you're familiar with and you look for bugs and you kill them and you collect these tiers. It's a very narratively, it's a very important task for Link to complete in the story of the game. It's a little lacking. I don't know what I would put in to like solve this. You know what? They do it actually kind of excellently. They have this version of this in Skyward Sword. And it's actually one of my favorite parts of Skyward Sword. I can't remember what they call it. They might also call it collecting tears. I'm not sure. I don't know if you've played Skyward Sword enough to have seen this, but there's basically parts in it where you're in a trial and you start inside this circle at the center of a familiar area. And once you leave the circle, various like robotic, sentient statues around the area that are huge and slow moving, actually very fast moving and aggressive, sort of run at you to kill you, and they will kill you instantly in one hit. And the idea is that if you pick up these tiers, sort of you get a few seconds or some time to move between this tier and the next tier without setting these things off. And when they set off this horrifying music that plays. That's essentially, you are immediately being chased, you should be terrified music. And it's like one of my favorite parts of Skyward Sword. It's absolutely terrifying. it's interesting. They do this visual sweep where they kind of show you where these tiers are, but there's also an element of like, hunting for them and doing kind of a bit of detective work. And there's only one permanent safe spot on the map, so that's very much kind of brings across that childhood feeling of like, running between spots and like having to freeze suddenly and that kind of like, fear thing. And so that was a really interesting way of doing it. And I feel like it's quite inspired by the tier collection. But if you have that in Twilight, which you do in Twilight Princess with no kind of pressure around doing that, it feels a little bit fetch questy or like, a kind of filler task, I suppose. I don't hate it because I like the environments in Twilight Princess. And so I just like controlling it. It feels great to control the game, in my opinion. So, it's not as huge a negative for me, but I've seen it essentially done well or done better. So if they ported that in literally across from one game to the other, I think it would improve the game overall. Or something, some kind of twist on that would be good, I think.
So, top 3 Zelda games. What would they be? Obviously, Twilight Princess at the top, and I would, at the risk of putting words in your mouth, I would probably guess Ocarina second.
And what would you guess third? Do you have a third guess for me?
Wind Waker.
Okay, you're very close. So Twilight Princess is first, obviously. Ocarina of Time is in fact second. But my third is Skyward Sword, because I like to piss off the most amount of people as I can at a time.
Chef's kiss.
I do. I love Skyward Sword. I think Skyward Sword is absolutely, it's beautiful. It's fantastic. The design is wonderful. I just mentioned, like, I think 3 times while we've been talking about Twilight Princess, I've mentioned things about Skyward Sword that I love. There's just so many like interesting design decisions in Skyward Sword. I fully agree with almost all of the criticisms I've seen of it. I just happen to love it, like, regardless of those issues.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yes, honorable mentions. Go for it. Do you have at least half a dozen?
I have so many. I heard about you. You messaged me about coming on the podcast, and I had to sit down and decide my favorite game, which is already terrifying to me because I'm one of those people who's like, I have a collection of games that I truly love, and even when I ask people like, oh, what's your favorite game? I'm like, oh, no pressure. You don't have to pick one. I'm just trying to get an idea. Because I think it does shift and change for people a lot. But I have so many games that I love so much. It's such a wonderful medium. So yeah, I made a way too long of a list, and then was told by my partner that's not going to work. This is like not a 7-hour long podcast. You're going to have to cut it down. So I have it down to 4, like ones that I was actually considering actually saying were my favorite game. In sort of in my top 5 as you would. So one of them being I mentioned this a little bit earlier, which is Silent Hill 2. Which is what a lot of people might guess would be my favorite game, and I have called it my favorite game at different points in the past. So for similar reasons, it's like I've also never really outside of this drawn comparison between Zelda games and the Silent Hill 2. But I did draw those comparisons earlier, and I kind of stand by a lot of the comparisons that I made about that kind of, sort of sadness, sort of darkness, and that sort of uncanny thing as well.
Just to put it out there, we've already had a Silent Hill episode from season 3, and I'm happy to have Silent Hill 2 come back at some point. Like, if anyone wants to come on and talk about Silent Hill 2, I'll encourage it. I'll happily embrace it. But for what it's worth, come to me with Silent Hill 3. I'll have you with arms wide open. just literally, so I can spend about. Well, let's assume that episode is going to be about 90 minutes long. I'll happily embrace you for about 45 of those 90 minutes. We can just talk about the intro and the opening song to the game.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally get it. Silent Hill 3 is absolutely an excellent game. It's fantastic. I do think that one of the reasons that people do talk about Silent Hill 2 a lot as their favorite Silent Hill game is because I think it kind of stands on its own. And I
Mm.
think that is appealing to people. It's one of the things that probably puts some people off of playing Zelda games. It's because like if I was someone who'd never played a Zelda game and I saw it, I would think, oh, there's probably like 17 books and like three mini game things and like a conference talk that I have to watch before I understand what's going on in this game. Like, and I do fully sympathize with people who come into something like that and they feel sort of, put out by it. So I do think that's part of why people list it because I think Silent Hill 3 is excellent. It's such an amazingly excellent game. It's got like a lot of what I love about Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3. It just has that like one step one level of complexity higher, which is like including more lore and more kind of world building and more kind of, character backstory and connection to previous games and things like that. That I think Silent Hill 2 doesn't express as much.
Um, what's next?
For me, another one that I love is Ace Attorney. I love Ace Attorney so much. Hard tone change again between.
It's like Zelda, jarring tone change.
Yeah, it's like that's what I kind of am. This weird mixture of like kind of goofy silliness and like this incredible darkness, and that's kind of a good kind of combo for me. If something does both those things, I really like it. So that's one of the reasons I love Ace Attorney is you take like the darkest subject matter, the most kind of grim dark context you can imagine. It's like a police procedural with lots of murder and crime, and then you just make it the goofiest, most ridiculous thing you can possibly imagine. But they still have like a sort of a level of like goofy, yes, but sincere also kind of content and context to it, which I really love. But I love the character designs. The music is obviously like iconic. I think the writing is hilarious. They actually did an excellent job. One thing I'd like to throw out there as well is an excellent job on the localization on Ace Attorney, which must have been a nightmare. I can't imagine because there's so many like contextual cultural jokes in that game. And it's like 100% almost written content. So it's a particularly impressive thing to see. But I've said that as well. I mean, I do love it. I played it so often on, my very second console that I owned, which was a DS. When I was a kid, I played it so often. But I also recently replayed the trilogy, which came out, which is remastered. Which, if anyone listening hasn't played it, you should definitely go play it. It's an excellent series. But yeah, I love the satisfying reveals in that game. I love the story. I love the characters. It's just great. It's a great fun game to play.
Have you played the Great Ace Attorney yet?
Yeah. That's so Ace Attorney.
No, the newer one that just came out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually haven't yet. I'm super excited too. I haven't actually been playing. This is interesting, actually. I could stick an honorable mention in here too, but I haven't actually been playing as many digital games in the last while, just because I've been working a lot and then doing a lot of like volunteer stuff and other things. Been very busy. But what I have been doing is because I've been locked in my home with my family. I've been playing a lot of board games. So I love board games, and it's one of the questions that I asked, yourself before I came on was like, is it a digital game or do we consider board games? Because that's going to significantly increase my options of what I'm talking about. But yeah, so any like sort of recently released stuff I've had a little bit trouble getting to, but yes, I'm very excited to play the newest Ace Attorney. It's gonna be a good time. I'll hit you
Next?
another one.
What's ready to bring it on?
Okay, another one is Telltale's The Walking Dead. Specifically season 1, I would single out as like one of my favorite games of all time. It's amazing. I really think I actually think it's kind of underrated, which is funny because it was huge when it came out, but I really do feel like it's one of my favorite games. The characters are unforgettable. The pacing is wonderful. The gameplay is a really cool concept. The writing's really strong. Every episode presents a different setting and a different problem to deal with. And I said this before. I said like I talked to my partner about this, and I said like, can I reasonably not include in my honorable mentions a game which I fully cried at the end? Like am I allowed to do that, to not include that? So I don't think many people cry to video games very often, But yeah, it broke a part of me
My
playing The
top
Walking
three
Dead.
games I've cried to. Like, there's at least. Let me think off the top of my head. There's at least four, five. There's at least five, six games in my top 10 I've cried to. So people do cry at video
Oh,
games.
see, video games are amazing. I think, yeah, this is like an argument for them being just a wonderful cultural product, and also another argument for game developers hating human beings. But you know, but games are beautiful, amazing medium, and they just like really, really touch people. And so, like, yeah, Walking Dead, broke a part of me that I'll never get back. But it's beautiful storytelling. You can feel, someone's real emotionally true story going into something like that, which I think
Mm.
is amazing to see in any medium, is a story that's really emotionally sincere, and it's an excellent game.
I feel I should probably point out, like, I played all of season one, fucking loved it, and I think for me, I I loved season one. I played it start to finish, broke me in huge ways. Like, I think it's either episode three or episode four where it just really fucking rips at you. It's
It just went
it went
fully,
there.
yeah,
It
it went
fully
there.
it went there. Like, exactly. Like, there are moments it's in one of those episodes anyway where it just like completely goes, haha, fuck your feelings,
Yeah.
basically. It's just like, oh my god, I can't handle this. And then
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel you, man. It's a lot. Um, but it's the and this is I think a big reason why I do consider it one of my favorite games, is it is telling a story about something difficult that happens to most people at some point,
Hmm.
um, thematically speaking, and that sort of storytelling about the human experience through something that honestly sounds really silly. It sounds silly to say, oh, the Walking Dead, the game, did this, but
Hmm.
the writers did an unbelievable job at presenting something that was very really impactful, I
Hmm.
think.
Um, the reason I also say that is because I actually have not played anything beyond season one. Actually, no, that's slightly like, I've not played anything beyond episode one of season two. But beyond that,
Mm,
I've not played anything from The Walking Dead. Like, I have an understanding of one or two things that have happened since then. But like, beyond that, I've not played it, and I don't know if
yeah,
that's a lack of interest or something else. But I feel like I should go back at some point and actually polish it all off. Um, like, especially considering now when I first played it, was on Xbox 360. Now they've come out onto newer machines since then. I just feel like maybe I should probably give. Just talking about it, I should probably go back and revisit these games again, because like, Telltale back in that sort of 2012, 2014, 2015 period, like, they were on it. They were really
yeah.
on it. Like, Walking Dead, um,
Wolf Among Us was
Wolf Among
also
Us,
fantastic. Yeah,
Tales from the Borderlands, and I'm not even the
yeah,
biggest Borderlands fan, but Tales from the Borderlands was fantastic. Like, that 3 year period with Walking Dead, Wolf Among Us, Borderlands, and a few other things, but especially those three, Telltale were really on it in that period. So,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that the season one of The Walking Dead is like kind of the golden example of that, in my opinion. I think it does some stuff wrong at different points. I think you could have, it's kind of to an extent, it's sort of niche. You're not going to appeal to every person who plays video games with a format like that. I think the format is really the thing that people mention sometimes as being sort of an issue. I think it's more of just it's built for a certain type of player, and
hmm.
you either like that kind of format or you don't for gameplay, and you like that kind of gameplay mechanic or you don't, that kind of loop. But yeah, I think it's absolutely a sort of a golden shining example of interesting characters, interesting presentation, interesting content, and fabulous execution.
Hmm. And especially as well, like, we also mentioned, I also mentioned how that sort of 3 year period, Telltale had these games coming out like Walking Dead, Wolf Among Us, Borderlands, stuff like that. That was also sort of when the advent of episode gaming sort of became a thing, because
Yeah, yeah.
there was not just Walking Dead, there was Life is Strange as well.
Yeah, that's true. And there's like, yeah, there was a kind of stream at that point of episodic games. I mean, it's still kind of happening. You still get the odd episodic narrative game coming out. I do think that's a really interesting format. I think it might even solve the sort of release problem that we were talking about earlier, the sort of pacing releases. And it's very interesting. But yeah, there was definitely a sort of a golden era of that where a lot of different places were trying things around that kind of release format, and it worked very well for a lot of narrative storytelling in games.
Hmm. But again, they sort of bring up that sort of double-edged sword. While the episodic format may solve some issues, like it may not solve others, like especially in regards to the sort of release of them. Because I remember especially Borderlands, like the release in like I think it was something like from episode 3 onwards, like the release period was sort of schematic and sort of not even schematic, scatterbrain and just sort
Yeah,
of all over the place. Whereas at least Life is Strange, at least just for the first game anyway, like they were coming out every 3 months or so, with the exception of the last episode, which took a bit longer, which was fair enough.
yeah,
And then you got things like Kentucky Route Zero, which took an age to sort of get over the line, and even now, Deltarune is coming out in chapters, but like
yeah,
those chapters are taking up years at a time.
yeah.
So who knows when we'll get the full story for that? So that
Yeah.
there's another double edged sort of aspect to it.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, but I do like the episodic format, and
Oh
especially, and
yeah,
this is another thing. This is another thing. Like as a player, like this is again another kind of possibly unpopular opinion. Where's the? I want the shorter games. I really like short games. I think there's a
yeah,
lot of like 100+ hour games, which I also love. Like I said, I'm replaying The Witcher 3 right
yeah.
now. And I love those kinds of games. Those kind of almost like hobby games. Um, but I really, really wouldn't mind having that feeling of completing an experience or completing a story or completing an environment or finishing something in a shorter period of time. I think a lot of people have very little time to play games nowadays. I think there's an audience for shorter game experiences, in my opinion, and I'd like to see more like games you can play in a day, in a weekend, stuff that's like 20 hours or less. I'd love to see some more projects like that, and I do hope we get to see that in the future.
I agree. But also, it's worth bearing in mind, I basically burned through Mass Effect 3 in the weekend it came out, basically. And that's meant to be a 40-hour RPG, and I burned through that Friday through late Sunday, early Monday morning. So
That's fair. I could probably play through Twilight Princess in a day. I wouldn't sleep, but I would. I
I
suppose it
bar-
depends on how many hours you play in a day.
I barely slept that weekend Mass Effect 3 came out. Actually, this also happened with Mass Effect 2 as well, but I digress. I digress. Your last honorable mention.
Last honorable mention. I have to go with again, a kind of a strange one, but I don't know if you know Another Code, Two Memories. Have you heard of this one?
Oh,
It's kind of a
it rings a bell. It rings a bell.
yeah.
It's a Wii game.
It is a DS game. It was the sequel
Oh,
was a Wii game.
oh,
Uh, yeah, and it was out on the original version of the DS when it came out, and oh, I love this game. It's kind of it's sort of an odd one. I love it so much. It's basically an exploration puzzle game.
mm.
You play as this sort of young kid called Ashley who, in video game fashion, returns to an island after receiving a letter from her supposedly deceased father, telling her that he's on the island and he's waiting for her. So she
How
returns
very
back.
Silent Hill-esque.
Kind of, definitely, and it was definitely praised at the time. Like some people said, it was this kind of very dark, unique, sort of atmospheric, sort of gameplay. It was very like tonally sort of creepier and darker, but it was intended for a younger audience. Like I'm not saying kids, but like say young adult sort of audiences. But it was really unique and odd. It had a lot of like kind of you traversed everything top down. And then you had these little like zoom in sections, sort of misty, like mist, where you would do these kind of puzzles in this kind of sort of half 3D environment. And the whole time you're trying to solve this mystery of what's happening, you meet up with another child who's a ghost child, which that story gets very dark very quickly. And you're trying to solve the mystery of what happened to him, who he is, what his memories are, and also yours, as you have this very distinct memory as a child of like this terrible thing happening, and you hiding, in your house while this thing happened with your parents, and it's a big mystery, and you traverse this like essentially this mansion on this abandoned island. It's very creepy and interesting. And while you do it, you're doing all these puzzles, and a lot of the puzzles are really, really interesting. So I'll give you like one really small example, which was I was playing and there's a puzzle where you have this picture on the bottom screen of the DS, and there's like a, this kind of imprint thing on the top, and you're like, I'm tapping things and I'm moving things around with buttons, and I'm leaving and coming back and leaving, coming back, and I'm trying to get items. I'm like, I have no idea what to do. And eventually I get really, really frustrated as a kid. I slam the thing shut and I put it down and I go about my business. I come back, and when I open it, I realize that it does the little noise like, you solved this puzzle. I'm like, wait a second. It's like, it was a stamp. The top bit was a stamp, and you had to like close it and open it in order to solve the puzzle. And there's just a lot of like little moments in that are really outside the box kind of puzzle solving moments. And again, it has this mixture of like, it's set in the modern day, but you're going back to this old castle that's sort of half like scientist like headquarters base, transformed from an older manor where half of it has never even been looked at. And it's like, it's this beautiful kind of like combination of worlds, sort of almost time shifting, multiple characters, not unlike Twilight Princess. there's through lines through everything that I like, that it's like a little bit dark. It's got like sort of very sort of sympathetic characters. It's got an emotional sincerity. There's definitely puzzles involved. A strong base of storytelling, a strong formula, and amazing atmosphere and tone. And if it has all those things, I'm down.
Yeah. Feels like as well, the way you were describing it, like it feels like there's elements of breaking the fourth wall in it as well.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I think sometimes that stuff is excellent and really interesting, and sometimes it just doesn't work. Like in Twilight Princess, when you have the stamps, sometimes it just breaks the fourth wall so much that you're just pulled entirely out of the atmosphere that you're in, and it just kind of spoils it. It's a very thin line you have to walk with stuff like that, but I think when it works incredibly well.
Okay, so top 3 games ever, what would they be? Obviously Twilight Princess top. Second or third, what would they be?
Twilight Princess has to be top. Silent Hill 2 has got to be second. Third is tough. God, that's really difficult. I mean, I probably have to be sort of predictable and probably say Ocarina of Time, because it was a bit too formative, and it's like, I'm not, by saying Twilight Princess is my favorite, I'm not saying Ocarina of Time is not one of the best games ever made, and it obviously is. And I think it's beautiful, it's melancholic, it's fun as hell, it's memorable, it's just wonderful. It's an excellent example of almost perfect game design. You can find me on Twitter at Ephemerellen. That's EPHEMEORELLEN. I think I have the world record for E's in a handle with that, by the way. I'm also one half of a game company based in Dublin/Cork, and it's called Plancheck Games. We make creepy magical games for creepy magical people. And one of our games is released on Steam right now. It's called So May It Be. It's a witch dating simulator, and you can go check that out. It's available right now. I also work for an indie game dev company out of Dublin called Gambrinus, and they have 2 games out right now. I was the lead writer on the game Cardpocalypse, which is an RPG about being a 90s kid, where you play a collectible card game battling against your friends in school. And I was a writer and a programmer on the very recently released remaster of Guild of Dungeoneering Ultimate Edition, which is recently released on Steam, which you can go and check out now.
Thanks for listening to My Favourite Game, a podcast by PlayDiaries.com where people from the games industry come on to talk of their favourite game. If you want to listen to future episodes of My Favourite Game, as well as press play before they go live publicly on Play Diaries and other podcast platforms, please consider becoming a $2 tier podcast early access patron to our Patreon at patreon.com/playdiaries. Next week, Shane McCafferty on Burnout 2. Until next week, bye bye.